Hello, my students. So today we're going to continue with the conversation that we started this week, right? So most recently we discussed the micro component, right, of social theory and culture and interaction. So today we're going to dive into how sociology is an actual science, right? And so this comes from chapter 3 from the classroom textbook. But then again, as I expressed before, we're not using textbook for the winter session. And so what we're going to be discussing today is we're going to discuss how sociology is a science, right? There's assumption about sociology that it's more philosophical. However, it's more actually very empirical. So we're going to kind of discuss those key components. And within sociology, you have different methodological approaches. So we're going to talk about two key methodological approaches. Just note that there are different variations of methodologies you can use in sociology. And I teach the methods course for my department. And so I teach the quant and the qualitative and for our undergraduate program, and for my master students, because I'm the master coordinator, I teach the methodology, right, the research methodology seminar, right, which is just conversation on research directives and such. As I discussed before, there is this assumption that sociology is philosophical, just because we rely a lot on certain theorists that tend to be philosophical. For example, Weber was a philosopher, or some attributed more into in relation to the philosophies. Marx is a philosopher, and so this is why Durkheim is the father of sociology, because Durkheim actually use the scientific methods to look at suicide rate. So if you're a queer major, you probably were introduced already to Durkheim, right? Because he was the first one to look at suicide rates among Protestants, and he compare individuals who were Protestant to other denominations such as Catholicism, and he assessed, which groups were at high risk of suicide among males. And so, while we do rely on certain philosophies and such, and again, this is because we do use theory. Sociology does use a theoretical frame, and so we rely on what's referred to as empirical evidence. That means that if for individuals that want to look at justice, right, so the conversation of justice, or then in the structure, you will look at where are those instances where we see justice, or someone who's interested in injustice, right? And so they'll use those empirical components to demonstrate how there's inequality in the system, right, or injustice, and they'll bridge it with a theory, right? Because remember, a theory is not bounded by time, right? And so therefore you're able to bring different facets and situations and connect it to one theory. And so this makes sociology empirical, meaning data information to answer questions, right? And so you engage and assessing a situation, or you develop a question, then you start what's referred to as deconstructing it, right? You start tearing it down, looking at that particular information. The other component is that it looks for these patterns, so it makes it systemic, right? And so what systemic entails is that it begins to look at connections to historical components, present components, and we make predictions of what are likely outcomes, right? And so this is where, because I'm a demographer, I'm a social demographer, so I do a lot with what's called probability theories and hazard regression, high risk regressions. And so that looks at risk factors, right? Also known as risk factors, who's at high risk and why. And, and so, um, this is where we're talking about empirical evidence is you're looking at data information to answer a question. And so you're trying to assess it in relation to a particular pattern, and that makes it systemic. And so just like every other science component, we do rely on the scientific method. And so familiarize yourself with what does that entail. So most individuals, right? So think of most all of us actually begin our daily lives and days with in the foot process of a scientific method, and that is there's a question, a question and needs of answers. And so when you ask yourself, I wonder if it's going to rain today, believe it or not, that is a question, right? Because the outcome could be it rains or it doesn't rain, right? You don't know what's going to happen. And so that is the first stage in any research, is a question, right? Now, most of us do engage in this relevant of literatures. And so the average individual, so let me just go ahead. The average individual engages in these first two in a daily life, right? It's when we ask a question and then we engage in the relevant literature. So here, if I'm asking, if I'm asking the question, is it going to rain today, right? For me, the relevant literature is if one is I begin to look at the Weather Channel. Is what is a Weather Channel, right? What does it say? Now, if it's going to rain today and I am in the Arctic, right? Now, granted, there's climate change, but so let's operate with the assumption that this is more hypothetical in nature, right? Or that I'm here in Pennsylvania, right? And so if I look at previous trends and I'm in February, the odds of it raining are pretty slim, right? If anything, I expect snow, right? And so that would be based on previous experiences, previous literature and components, right? And so that is a scientific method right there. And then the average individual engages this. Now, in our society, and I bring this up because it's relevant, because you hear that a lot about vaccinations and such, right? There's people saying, do your own research. You actually don't. So this is most individuals, right, are actually just engaged in the literature, right? They're not doing research. And so when we're talking about the scientific method, we're encompassing all these components of doing research, right? And so that is the key aspect about research. So when someone is saying like, oh, do your own research, what they're really saying, convey to you is just look at the literature, right? Because literature actually, of doing research, it actually takes time. Regardless of the methodology you're using, it's gonna take substantial time for you to actually engage in the actual research, right? So let's go ahead and talk about the other aspects of research, where now you have individuals who then develop and the average, the individuals who actually engage in furthering their thought process. So this is a question, this is a relevant literature. Now, relevant literature is not necessarily literature that echoes, right? Because so this is what's key important is that here, the relevant literature is literature that, one, is in conversation what your topic is. Two, you also begin to look at the pros and cons. The pros and cons section falls into your hypothesis. So your hypothesis, this is also more in relation to quantitative, right? For those of you who are familiarized with statistics, you learn, about rejecting, accepting the null hypothesis, right? And you always want to get that magical number of less than 0.05. Now here, you know, you either reject or accept, okay? And that type of component is based on the outcome, right? So that is all, you're not drawn to any conclusions yet. All you know is like, okay, either I accept it or I reject it. Now, let's say, for example, if you were using a theory, remember last week we did, I'm sorry, last week, on Monday we discussed on theories, right? Or no, last week, yeah, it was last week when we discussed the different types of theorists. Substitute hypothesis with premise, right? So the term premise is your claim, and that is when you use a theory, you use the term of premise. What is your premise? That means what is your claim? And so this is your theoretical orientation. Now, what happens with relevant of literature is that your literature, your relevant literature is any, as I expressed before, is anything pertaining to your topic. Now, the relevant literature is not to trap you in what's referred to as an echo chamber, right? So most, and this is where most individuals stop, because what happens is, on average, when we have a question, we usually engage what's referred to as that term, right? An echo chamber is we look for narratives that support our claim. Research doesn't do that. Research, on the contrary, wants to reject your claim. The goal of research is to reject what you're saying, okay? Or, you know, and so you're trying to find flaws in your form of thought, right? And so that is the purpose of research. Now, you do want to be proven right, right? But you have to go through this tedious process of research, right? Now, granted, right, in the back of your mind, you're like, please, please be true, please be true. However, you have to allow it to go through the scientific method. So everything starts off with the hypothesis, right? So again, this is your question, your relevant literature, which also then provides what's called counter literature, right? Or opposing literature that talks about, well, this could not be the case, and this is why, and it's right. And so this is where, on average, the individual stops. The average individual just engages in these two, right? So when someone says doing your literature, do your own research, you're not doing your own research. You're just engaged in literature, because the research actually requires these other steps. So here is when you now are, oh, that's cool. I didn't know I could do that. So here is when you're now looking for those patterns. Okay. So so that is now from this section onward, now you're engaged in research. And this is where everything becomes time consuming. So then the next process is methodology. Your research method, also known as your methodology, is the technique. Okay, so your technique, there are different conversations about positivism and such, where we're going to control for those. So here, excuse me, your method is your first and foremost, are you looking at it inductively or deductively, right? So inductive, deductive. Inductive is you move in directionalities. Okay, well, so let me, you know what, let me start with the inductive and deductive. All right, so think of a methodology is, your method is the techniques you're going to use, and there are going to be two, and let's just go ahead and focus on those two. So there's qualitative and quantitative, right? And so quant means quantity. Qualitative means quality. So quantity, numbers, quantitative is numbers, qualitative is individual. Okay, so just keep that in mind. When we're talking about quantitative, we're talking about samples, we're talking about big numbers, and we're going to get to there in a second. All right, so that is your methodology, is the techniques you're going to be using to test your hypothesis, right? And that is determined on certain factors. Is your time frame? What is your time frame? right? Is there funding, right? So there's a lot of agents playing out here for you to actually do your research. Do you need, the questionnaire? So here your research method is essential because once you determine the technique you're going to be using, and again, controlling for the instruments, because those are different components. Then here, what you're now determining is how am I going to ask the questions? And then therefore, we now move into collect data, right? Now you're going to start assessing the gathering of information. Now, so this is where you can use census data, secondary sources, right? You can do your own interviews, your own surveys. And so that is the collection of data. On average, you need, for doing interviews, you need 30 people, right? And that's just because 30 people will give you now granted, some say, well, that is a very small sample size, right? And so we're not moving heavily into statistics here, but that is that sample that will be representative of the population. So let's say, for example, if I wanted to gather this, the perception of my students in the classroom. If I interview one person in a classroom of 50, that is not a true representation of the class, right? So that's referred to as true representation or true population, right? Because what that person says, it was, can actually have a variance in what the students in the classroom actually think as a whole, right? Or whereas where I have 30 students in a classroom of 50, that's a pretty good sample size, right? Because now that's a substantial portion. So on average, we usually, anything that can be considered like 5% of the population, of the true population, is pretty substantial. And so here, that is a collection of data, right? Is how collect data is looking at a news article, and the reason being is because certain methodologies are historical, and this is for those individuals who are looking at archives and historical data, right? And so that's collection of data, and then you analyze your data, right? And so the analyze the data. Now, granted, there's other steps. We're going to stop here. So analyze the data is that you start interpreting what the information says, right? And so that is the analyzing the analysis of data, is that now you start interpreting what all that information entails, right? This is a scientific method, and it takes substantial time. Like, for example, for me to finish a project, right, from point A to point B, on average, it takes me about 4 or 5 months. And that is if and that is if I'm using just secondary data. So secondary data for me would be like census, the National Institute of Health, National Institute of Education, right? Look at their data set and, tinker with their variables. And variables are characteristics, right? Like, for example, sex, age, height, BMI, body mass index, right? Those are variables. Those are key characteristics of an individual. So this is what we mean by the scientific method. All right. Let me clear this. So now, oh, whoa, why are you checking? Oh, because still more. This is so cool. All right, let me clear my check mark. All right. So now the reason why you're doing research, it is so other individuals can replicate the study. The purpose of the scientific method is to jot down the steps that you did to show your finding, right? And this is why when I go to forums and I hear someone talking about X and Y, for me, it's like, okay, what's your source, right? If you engage in this research, what was the method you used, right? How do you gather your data? Who was included? Who was excluded? Why were they included? Why were they excluded, right? the scientific method, what it is a print for others. Okay, so this is why science is very important. Is because it lays out the steps that were taken for you to come to your your findings, right, or the analysis of your data, where you can either accept or reject your null hypothesis, or you're able to support your premise, right? And the reason being is because we use the scientific method for, first and foremost, is reliability, right? And reliability, what that entails is it can be replicated. So reliability for using the scientific method, what that tells is anyone else that reads your paper, what you're saying is, if you follow these steps and look in the similar population that I did, right, or that we did, this should be the outcome you should come to, right? And so this, and so then that finding is reliable, right? Is that it does, it first and foremost, it did a phenomenal job in the methodology, in the scientific, in the scientific community through the research, and then that, then therefore it can be replicated, right? So that is why one engages in the scientific method, right? Is by reliability, validity, that it valid, that it actually, it does answer the question, right? So you'd be surprised how many papers begin in one topic and end up somewhere else, right? And so here, when we're talking about validity, is that it does answer the question that it started with, right? And so that's referred to as validity. And this is the key components for the scientific method. Now, what are the differences? Okay, so there are several different of methodological approaches. And as I mentioned before, there's qualitative, quantitative, and mixed methods. I am a mixed method researcher, and my passion, or my I guess tendency has always been qualitative. However, I was trained as a quantitative person. And so qualitative, again, to reiterate, qualitative, right, has to do with quality. And so quality here is one-to-one, people-based research, right? You're talking to one person, it's in-depth, and so it's a very tedious process because it takes time to develop rapport, relationships, right? And so that is referred to as qualitative research. Qualitative research, if you, the goal is 30 interviewees. However, if you can get, if you're able to find 15 to 20 participants, that's phenomenal in qualitative. Here, the information is very rich, right? Very personal, very intimate interaction. Quantitative research is just quantity, right? More numeric. And so this is where we're now talking about surveys. Surveys tend to be qualitative. Now, surveys also have a very low response rate, and so that's why it's mass distributed, right? You send out 1,000 surveys, you hope to have 50 people, respond to your survey. And so the argument is for quantitative, that it gets a true assessment of the population, just because there's more individuals that can partake in qualitative research. The con to it is that is very impersonal, because it just looks at a trend. It doesn't really focus on specific characteristics of individuals, whereas qualitative is very focused on a key component. And so this one really tends to be more of a premise. So usually individuals who do theory tend to do more qualitative than quantitative, unless you're dealing with a macro theories, right? So okay, and then there is mixed methods. And so mixed methods is accumulation of both qualitative and quantitative. This is a rising field in research. So there are very few individuals who are experts in mixed method, just because it requires the individual to be an expert in both of these two areas, right? Qualitative and quantitative. And so but you do have research as mixed methods, right? So what tends to happen is that a research team is developed where one person in that research team is an expert in one of these areas, and then you have another individual expert in the other area, and they work together to form this kind of research, which is mixed methods. Now, you also see this a lot in sports. So think of mixed methods when someone is going to bat, or an athlete that's going to score a touchdown, gets a reception, right? You have the commentator giving you statistics of the individual for that season, right, or career, and then so that is the quantitative component, right? But then they share a personal narrative, personal story about them, right? That's the qualitative component. And so so that is the mixed methods. Now, some of you are like, wow, this sounds phenomenal. Well, the criticism to mixed methods is that this assumption that, well, it's just, so you're in a sense kind of standing in the road, right? In the middle of the road is if you use mixed methods, then while there's benefits of both kind of approaches, that means you also get the downside to the downs, you get the cons to either of these methods as well, right? Now, which theory is better, or which methodological approach is better? That is up to the researcher, right? That is, again, based on the question you're asking, the time you have, the resources you have available. And so, either of these is very effective, right? And so that's all dependent on the person. Now, there is an expansion of mixed methods that we're not going to be covered, because there's different types of mixed methods. And so, but just know that there is this methodological approach referred to as mixed methods, right? Mixed methods tend to be the very umbrella of its subcategories. All right, so let's go ahead and discuss the forms of qualitative research. So qualitative research, this is the one that tends to be very popular, right? Known as participant observation. So participant observation is interviews, right? It's when you sit down and you talk to people, that is referred to as participant observation. Usually requires you to go to the field, right? That means, yeah, you're immersed. For those of you who study anthropology or are anthropologists, you're probably going to be doing this kind of qualitative research, and in other areas is referred to as ethnography, right? And so that is qualitative, and so you're looking at, that's participant observation. And so here it's more of a conversation based. On average, you have about 30 minutes per interview. Another form of qualitative research is, this is going to be in the exam, netography. Netography. So netography is, in a sense, going online and looking at people's comments, right? Such as discussion, kind of like forums, discussion forums, that in certain instances is public, so you follow what people are saying online. That is a rising field. Companies are looking for individuals who are familiarized in netography. So think of reviews, right? That companies that sell a product, and then they have the review, and depending on how many stars you give them, right? Then someone is looking at that information. They're not necessarily looking at you have one person looking at the stars to get the average, which is quantitative, right? But then you're looking at individuals, the comments, right? And that is the qualitative component of it, right? And so that is referred to as netography. Okay, so there's also netography on, on comment section, YouTube, and people comment and such. And so it's looking for human behavioral patterns, structural patterns. That is a rising field. And so, so yeah, and it's used a lot in marketing, I believe. It's referred to as netography. Netography. All right. So now let's go ahead and move into the form of qualitative research. Remember what I said about this one? This one has to do with with surveys and questionnaires, right? And so there are different type of qualitative quantitative research survey research. One is statistics. Statistics is numerical data, right? It's that when you're looking at averages, you just want to look at that data. There is no interpretation. And there is what's referred to as descriptive statistics, and that's trend over time, right? So for those individuals who are interested in early childhood development, or in education, in the field of education or psychology or social psychology, you probably will do descriptive statistics. And what it is that you do one study with one group, and then in a year or in a semester, a couple months later, you do another study with the same group, right? And so that is a trend over time, right? So this is done to look at adolescent developments, children performance in education in school. That is referred to as descriptive statistics, right? You're looking at the same group over an extended period of time. And then you have inferential statistics. Now, this is referred to as theoretical statistics. And the reason being is because you're trying to make a prediction about an outcome in society that can be measured, right? So so here, inferential statistics is in a sense uses theory, right? So when we're talking about, say, conflict theory, which remember you recall is exploitation marginalization. And so you're saying that women are exploited by their employer more so than males, right? And so you're controlling for age, you're controlling for levels of education, you're controlling for racial, ethnic characteristics. And so the only variable that you want to measure is sex and the occupation itself, right? So those are two variables you're looking at. So that similar occupation and the sex of the person. And so here, all of a sudden you see that males on average get paid more than females, right? That is an inferential statistics. You're looking at the income or the income earnings of males versus females, and therefore you connect it to a theory, which is conflict, like, to explain exploitation marginalization, right? And so that is inferential statistics. So in conclusion, sociology is a science. It's a phenomenal field. It's an amazing field. Some pretty cool stuff you get to observe, to be engaged. If you're interested in sports, there's sociology of sports. If you're interested in nutrition, there's sociology of food. If you are interested in gender inequality, sociology of gender. You're interested in politics, there's sociology of politics, right? Or also, sociology of sports, as I mentioned. If you're interested in medicine, there's sociology of medicine. And so sociology is everywhere because we interact everywhere, right? And so the only field that doesn't have sociology might be biology. But then if you're interested in how how we relate or interact with marine life, then that is sociological, right? And so again, because it looks at society, it looks at people interacting with each other. So as you learn, there are several methodological approaches. Find one that fits best for your research question. And so again, there is no right one. There is no best one. I'm a mixed method researcher right now. I find myself doing geographical informational mappings, and also I do a lot of also could refer to as weighted statistics, and that's when you start adding these things called weights to the population, so you can kind of make it equal or more true to the true population if your sample is small. So right now I'm heavily engaged in statistics. A while back I was really engaged in qualitative. And then somewhere in between, I did this mixed methods project, right? And so yeah, so it's up to your discretion. Okay, so just know that what determines the methodology or the scientific approach you're going to take. It's the question you're asking, and also what's going to determine how further you dive into that rabbit hole is depending on resources, funding, and time. Right, that's always the key components for our research. Even as us faculty, we have these great ideas, but then we weigh it against our time and is there funding available, right? And sometimes you don't have you have limited opportunities of both. So you know. Your great research idea stays back there and it's never comes to the forefront, unfortunately, but that's just reality. Okay, so again, that concludes today's conversation, and we have come to the end of the semester. You have a phenomenal I think a week and a half of break, and then we're back in the spring. So yeah, my office is in McElhaney, room 112F. If you just ever want to stop by and say hello, please, you're more than welcome to do so. Okay, adios.